To Lift Studios Broadcast 011. This week, the Lift team gathers in the front of the studio for a conversation about the open source movement and its great technologies.
Hi everyone, we're here today with the whole crew. On one side I've got Cam Lee, I'm Haig Armin, we've got Travis Nicholson and Andrea Mignolo, and we're going to talk about open source technology, open source culture, and how that impacts us as a design studio, and what are some of the questions around, and open source is becoming quite a hot topic lately, and so we're going to start a bit of a discussion about that. I think it's important that we define what we're talking about before we start talking about it. What is open source? I have a lot of students that ask me what open source is, and it's a pretty hard thing to nail down exactly. It's pretty wide and varied in their definitions, but who'd like to try to attempt one?
I mean, I know the very general kind of approach, which is that it's essentially any piece of code that you have access to the source for that code, so that you're kind of free to modify and build upon that code in any way that you see fit. Granted, that's a very loose definition, and I'm sure there's a lot more specifics out there. I know Andrea actually knows.
Do you want to add to that?
About the specifics.
Well, I mean, open source also applies to distribution. Like, you have to be able to redistribute the code. And I think a good example would be Windows versus Linux, right? Windows is an operating system, but it's compiled and you don't have access to the source. So when there's a security problem, when you want to add to it, if you want to contribute, you can't, because you can't reverse engineer that core. As opposed to Linux, you can get every single bit of the source file, you can recompile the kernel, you can do whatever you want to it, you can give that back to the community, and it's always making it better.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. I think open source is more than just a technology, and it's really an attitude or a culture. It's a cultural shift towards sharing. I think at its base level, it's about something will be better if you've got many minds thinking about how to solve a solution rather than a small team. And so things like the Firefox browser is a much better browser than IE was when it first came out, because it had this huge community that was working on the code, and various teams working on various parts of the browser, and by the time it was launched, it was by far the best browser out there. So that kind of attitude, I think, really, to me, sold me on the whole idea of open source. And there's open source as a culture is spreading to other disciplines. It's not just a software. I mean, it started with software, right?
Yes, definitely.
But it's now, I'm hearing designers talk about open source. I think we'll probably get into this a little bit in the later parts of our discussion, but I'm really excited about open source architecture. There's a lot of architects that are sourcing out a problem and getting other architects from around the world to try to feed into a solution.
Definitely. I just want to kind of build off what you're saying, and
Yeah.
I think a really kind of core concept to the idea of making something more open source is the idea of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
That, the traditional model of kind of software development specifically has been that, you have your core team of developers, and they go off and develop something, and then they release it, and then the community gives feedback, and those same developers go back and fix those issues and then re-release. But the open source model is radically different in that basically when you release that code to the public, everyone then has access to it to contribute back to it. And I think in the long run, it makes software much more sustainable in the long run, because as opposed to having to wait for the development team to come back with fixes, the community's right there to support those issues and help correct them, much quicker and earlier in the process.
Yeah.
I think you're completely on par with that idea, because a lot of the misunderstandings and a lot of the criticisms of the open source community and the way open source works is based on this idea of the best things come from like a single artist or a single person to work on them, and like a lot of books and a lot of those things really fall back on that idea of one person really taking control of something, whereas with new technologies and new ways of working with other people, I think as a culture we're beginning to understand that one person doesn't just always have the best idea, and it is collaboration, and it is people working across the globe on separate projects, and each person perhaps taking a small part of it to make that small part work the best, and then as a whole all the systems work well together because they're all fully functioning little parts.
Definitely.
Yeah, let's move on to the myths around open source. I think one of the main things that we want to talk about is I think there's a lot of misconceptions around open source, and the first one being that open source just means free. It means you get free software. Woohoo. So how's that not right?
Well, in a lot of senses, it is right, because most of the software that is released as open source doesn't generally have a cost associated directly with the software. But that's also very misleading, because there are actually a lot of companies out there that have integrated open source ideals into their actual business model, and some of those companies have turned out to be very, very profitable. And Andrea,
You want to be a little bit specific about that?
Yeah, I was just kind of getting into it. I mean, Andrea brought up two really great examples, which are MySQL and Red Hat, the primary developers of Linux as an operating system. And just popping on the Red Hat website, they go into great detail about why they've opted to kind of build the open source methodology and kind of thinking right into the core of their organization. And I think they've been really successful at treading that very fine line between kind of a traditional business model and still propagating the ideals of open source.
So just to give some people a bit of a backstory, Red Hat, and correct me if I'm not totally right on this, is a company that packaged Linux in a specific way and sold it for, I think it was is that not true?
It's a little bit different. So in the beginning, Red Hat was just another Linux distribution, and it was fully free. And then around, I think at Red Hat 7, when they moved to Red Hat 8, they split into Red Hat Enterprise and Fedora, Fedora is a continuation of the original Red Hat.
Yeah.
Kind of everything's free line. And then Red Hat Enterprise is aimed at corporations and enterprise use, where the code is still open source, but you're paying for support services pretty much.
Right. Okay. I know another example that reminds me of the Red Hat story that's closer to what we do, which is there was a group that took Drupal back in 4-point-something days and packaged it specifically for what's the right word for it? I guess loosely speaking, activism online. They made a package that has all the tools that you need to make a website and that's CivicSpace.
Okay.
CivicSpace actually costs money now, but it's a really lethal kind of combination of Drupal, the core Drupal content management system, and a bunch of modules.
Yeah, this
Any
is
other
actually
examples?
a model that we kind of have seen come up again and again in the open source world, and probably the newest one that I've worked with is actually Magento.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Magento is a technology that we've used with one of our clients, Obaki. We discussed it in a fair bit more detail in, I think, the first podcast that we released. So if you want some more information on that, you can go back and take a look at that. Yeah. But Magento kind of has a very similar business model to Red Hat, in that the actual software that they produce is open source. It's free to download, it's free to use on your server, but where they kind of make money from that is that they sell these kind of subscription models, which basically gives you direct contact with the developers behind it. And that's where the kind of I guess selling point is for people who are really looking to use this at kind of an enterprise level, that it's having someone that you can kind of phone up and say, hey, we've got this problem, and have someone who really knows the ins and outs of the whole application there to kind of support you and help you get through issues, is a big advantage for a lot of people. And not having to shell out that initial cost to just pay for the software in the first place makes that a bit more sustainable for them. It kind of offsets the initial bulk of cost and kind of rolls it into a more subscription-based model. So that's one model that comes up again and again in the open source world is the idea of kind of subscription based payment.
Yeah.
They're definitely moving away from license based.
Yeah.
Which I think also speaks to the sustainability that came up earlier, is that you have this very sustainable business model as opposed to you bought the license, now what do you do?
Yeah.
That's when you have to keep rolling out crap products like Microsoft does.